Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you had as much fun watching that as I had making it. My name is Brad Chapman, and I am a systems engineer for a large entertainment company. We have produced a number of universally acclaimed motion pictures and television shows. Our team manages about 10,000 Macs at present, and I want to do full disclaimer, the opinions shared in this presentation do not necessarily reflect those of my employer. I gave the presentation about APNS in 2017, and Apple's push notification service has gone from being nice to have to absolutely essential for managing Apple devices. And my objective for this session is to explain why, now more than ever, effective device deployment, administration, and management strategies depend on them being able to communicate with APNS. During my brief time as an Apple Enterprise SE, I learned firsthand that customers are deeply passionate about these products and services, and they also have really high expectations about what success looks like with Apple device management. So sometimes they just needed guidance about best practices, and other times they really needed pro services to dive in and help them discover what was wrong and try to fix it. And since Apple employees are not allowed to give recorded presentations at these conferences, I've compiled this in the hopes that I'm an acceptable substitute. So here's kind of what we're going to do for this presentation. We're going to take a look back at the highlights of my presentation from 2 years ago, and then we'll talk about the future of MDM, which is right now, which is what you should have been doing 18 months ago and preparing for today. And then in the middle of the presentation, we'll do one demonstration of how to analyze traffic from your Apple devices to understand how they're communicating with Apple. We will also see what an ideal enrollment and deployment kind of looks like. It's a real brief video demo of setting up a Mac. And then we'll also look at some things that do not work when they can't communicate with Apple. And then we'll close out with some last words and sort of my closing thoughts on this, and really a closing argument about why this is really important to do in your organization. So a quick look back at the highlights from 2017. Let me see if this clicker is working now. As I said before, if you only have 1 minute to send this to your bosses, these are the 7 things they need to know about APNS. Push notifications are small packets of data that send instructions to a device. APNS uses Akamai for global traffic management and has multiple security factors for integrity and authenticity. It's required now for secure delivery of configuration profiles. You can't get around this. Devices expect a direct, persistent connection to the internet. You have to allow outbound connections to Apple, but you never need to allow inbound, unsolicited connections from Apple. The hosts and ports for the APNS service really haven't changed a whole lot. I had this slide in my last presentation. It's really for review at this point. The first 2 are server-side. The third one is for devices to initialize communication with APNS. It downloads a bag file. And then there's the courier service. That's how they receive push notifications. The API at the bottom really hasn't been used a whole lot, mostly by high bandwidth applications like Facebook and Twitter and things that send billions of notifications every year. I had a map in the presentation that showed all of the points of presence for Akamai. There were 16 of them, and it translated to about 2,000 IP addresses. The actual list of points of presence has changed. The functionality of the service really hasn't changed, but just so you can see that there are some different names of those endpoints, including one in Africa now. Hooray! So we have some coverage on another continent. The rules of the road here. Apple still owns the 17 block, and their services use certificate pinning, so you cannot decrypt an SSL session and try to re-encrypt it within the certificate. It will be dropped because Apple will reject that connection. Jamf still uses the binary protocol for APNS to send notifications from the server. But a few things are hosted outside the 17 block, and I really didn't touch on this too much in my last presentation, and I think it's important to say this, that, for instance, the initialization services that are used by FaceTime, iTunes, and APNS, they download, but it basically amounts to a plist from these servers, and then it decodes it. It's in the base 64 format. There's a key file, a certificate, and then some configuration parameters. All of the content delivery networks used by Apple devices are also, in large part, hosted outside Apple's network by Akamai, no surprise. And there's a certificate validation that has to take place. That's all hosted outside the 17 range. And then other services that I may not even have caught or mentioned that will come up. So it's a good idea to set your firewalls to whitelist by hostname rather than by IP address. So with that, I'm just having trouble with this remote today. Let's go back to the future. What has changed for Mac administration since JNUC 2017? But first, this just in, a breaking news release about APNS. Let's go to Tom in the field. We have a big announcement about APNS. This came just last week. The binary protocol will be sunsetted in November 2020. So that means Jamf is going to have to change something about how they deliver push notifications. Apple wants everybody to move to the HTTP2 API. What's great about this is that it will allow for high-speed parallel processing of notifications and improved error handling, and then feedback about every single notification. So if you manage 100,000 devices and you want to do a fast push to the entire fleet, this should help things. There's a link at the bottom for the actual article, and I have a reference at the end of the presentation with every single link that you're going to see. So we'll go on from that. Now, what's new from Mac? Well, we got 10 big things that we need to talk about that have changed since the fall of 2017. So we'll start off with the T2 chip. It's an incredibly complex system on a chip that provides real-time encryption, hardware management, boot security, and a whole lot more. And Apple devices ship from the factory with the full security mode enabled, so you need to plan your deployments around this being turned on. So operating systems have to be signed by Apple at the time of installation, and they have to be online to verify it, just like an iPhone. And then no external boot devices allowed. So if you are planning to use like a Mac deploy stick, you have to do some additional things to use external boot media on a system like this. Here's a link to the articles, and we'll move on. The next thing that hit us was user-approved MDM that dropped in macOS 10.13.2. What this meant is that the user would have to manually approve an MDM enrollment by clicking on a button, and you could not click it remotely. So it looked like this, a little approve button right in the middle of the screen, and so then that would be the only way to get an MDM profile installed safely and allow the computer to accept management commands. There was an article there about how to prepare for those changes. Jamf thankfully followed up with version 10.3 that changed the enrollment process that now loads two profiles of the certificate authority and an MDM. You need APNS to confirm the enrollment. It will not complete if you cannot reach APNS. But the MDM profile will be marked as user approved this way, which is nice. The Quick Add package, Jamf says it's not deprecated, but it might as well be because any computer that's 10.13 and above, when you go to enroll it, it's going to offer you the twin profiles. The only exception to that is if your Jamf account or your support team gave you a custom knob to turn off to force a Quick Add package to be delivered. We did that for a while. Most environments probably never did that. There's a link to the article about managing user-approved MDM. Then, of course, there was secure kernel extensions, which are blocked by default. You get a message like this. The user has 30 minutes to approve it. You want to whitelist these things. They need a user-approved MDM on the machine. And Mr. Rich Troughton has a great article about how to discover those kernel extensions by their team ID and set up whitelisting. So thank you for that. Next, we have the evolution of the device enrollment program, which is now Apple Business Manager and Apple School Manager. This was introduced sometime in the spring of last year. This is great because we now have this concept of automated device enrollment. That's the nomenclature I think we should be learning how to use here. What's also nice about ABM and ASM is that you can get multiple pre-staged workflows by defining different MDM tokens. So if you have tvOS devices or Apple TVs, you want to have a different type of enrollment profile for those versus your Macs on iOS devices. You can filter those all out, which is really convenient. MDM profiles, of course, are user approved, and this is the gateway to supervision through these programs. Then, of course, we have the dreaded transparency, consent, and control, and the privacy policy. What is it? PPPC, privacy policy preference controls. Thank you. Thank you for that. So these have kind of been in macOS for a while, but we really didn't have to deal with them so much. They weren't so in your face, and they didn't block a lot of things. But I think with Mojave, we started to see, you know, the camera and the microphone were user prompts, and you can't really manage those. But things like full disk access and automation, those were a couple of new things that really caught us by surprise with all the scripts that we use in a typical deployment. So user has to approve permissions once for every app. You can whitelist these with a user-approved MDM profile. And then here's a couple of articles and a webinar from Jamf about how to manage these. Then, another surprise, during the Mac Mojave beta period, remote desktop had a change. A lot of us have used the kickstart command to set up control and observe on a Mac. They removed the ability to do that with the command somewhere in the middle of the beta cycle. This bit a lot of customers that deploy Mac Minis headless in data centers. So there was a lot of impact statements that had to be given to product engineering. We were talking to customers at the time that was affecting. This is while I was an SE at Apple, so this was kind of a big one. Obviously, this upset a lot of people, so we had to deal with this. You can enable this with user-approved MDM, and then here's an article about how to manage Kickstarter, use it, and how it behaves in 10.14. Then we have something new that your SEs have been talking to you about. The Appleseed for IT program used to be invite only. You had to ask your SE to invite you, your beta testers, and it was kind of a hassle because you could only use your personal Apple ID. Well, now you can use a managed Apple ID that you can invite people by setting up accounts in ABM and ASM, or you can even delegate this to a staff admin in Business Manager and School Manager. We want to be in the mindset of always testing and providing that feedback to Apple through the feedback assistant, because that will improve the product in the long term. Then, something that we don't all need to pay attention to, but there are certain industries and certain organizations that depend on ISO certifications to convince management and to be allowed to use Apple products in their environment. Apple spent a great deal of time getting these certifications nailed down. ISO 27001:2013 for info security management systems, and 27018:2019 for cloud services that handle personally identifiable information. These are the links to all of those certifications down there. Just a list of the services that this covers: iCloud, iMessage, FaceTime, Siri, APNS, Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager, Business Chat, iTunes U, Schoolwork, and Managed Apple IDs. And now, of course, we come to macOS Catalina. We have app notarization that takes place that requires an internet connection to validate the app signature and do continual checks for malware even after it's been notarized. And we now have the possibility to supervise Macs in Catalina for the very first time, which requires them to be in Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. We have additional controls for TCC and for notifications that, again, require user-approved MDM to whitelist. You also can do activation lock if you have a T2 Mac, and if you have a supervised Mac, this is the only way to be able to override that with MDM. So you can either prevent your users from using this, but if you don't block it and they turn activation lock on, the only way to remove this is if it is a supervised device. So if you want to learn a little bit more about managing MDM settings, there's a few links here. First of all, MDM settings for IT administrators is an online manual of payloads, restrictions, commands, and queries. The Mac deployment guide is a comprehensive overview of all aspects of Mac deployment and how to set up an MDM, not any specific vendor solution. And then the Worldwide Developer Conference 2019 session 303 was presented by a number of people, but I wanted to highlight and specifically Rick Lemon, who talks about the SSO extension. That grew out of the Enterprise Connect project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So it's really nice to have that baked into the operating system. Now, take a little swig of water. This is the part where my mouth is dry and I need to wet the whistle. So, thank you for that. So, this whole presentation is about understanding why it's important for devices to talk to Apple. You have some skeptics in your organization who maybe don't trust it or want to learn more about it. There are some things that I'm going to show you that you can do yourself before you even start having those conversations with InfoSec. And you don't have to be a network expert to do this. So some basic analysis tools that we can use that are either free or very inexpensive. We have Little Snitch, Pi-hole, and Wireshark. So let's talk about the first one. Little Snitch is a Mac native software produced by Objective Development. It has a beautiful user interface with lots of filters. It checks for application co-signatures at runtime for those things that are requesting network access. And you can also do packet capture with Little Snitch, and you can also filter it down to the individual app or service that you want to monitor. So this is quite different from doing something like a TCP dump. Because it's running at the operating system level and only watching apps, you can monitor layers 3 through 7, so starting with the IP address, TCP connection, all the way up to the presentation and application layer. Give you a quick look at the UI. This is the first screen that shows the apps on the left, a map of where the connections are going, and a detail on the right about the binary itself, all the connections it's tried to make, when it made them, and the ports that it was using. It also has dark mode, hooray. And then here's a couple of other screens. So this is the rules list. A lot of these are built automatically, but if you have a program that it doesn't recognize, it's going to show you this and say, this application wants to connect to the internet. Do you want to allow it once, now, this host, this domain, this port, forever, etc., and you can allow or deny, and you can also edit those rules later. So this is good for understanding like a specific process within the operating system if you want to see what it's connecting to. Next, the Pi-hole. Quick show of hands, who has used a Pi-hole or knows what it is? Oh, beautiful. All right, so for those who don't, the Pi-hole is a piece of software, but most people know it as a piece of hardware. It's an ultra-compact DNS server that runs, it was designed for the Raspberry Pi platform, so it's a tiny computer that fits in the palm of your hand, has USB, HDMI, Ethernet, and you can build Wi-Fi into them. You can also download the Pi-hole software and install it in a virtual machine or in a Docker container. What it's good for is testing networks and understanding what devices are connecting to which hosts and what kind of DNS requests they're making. And you can generate blacklists and whitelists. It has extremely detailed logging, and it is free and open source. So it's a good way to plug a device into the network and see everything that it's trying to connect to, basic DNS queries, and how often and when it's making them. Here's a quick look at the UI. This is a web-based interface. So you log into it, supply the password, and there's a couple of screens that you can check out, and there's a list of the servers that it connected to and when they connected. Next, Wireshark. Most of you might have heard of this or have already used it. It is the ultimate packet inspector. It's been around for over 20 years. It captures all traffic on a specific interface, so layers 2 through 7, and you get detailed analysis and export functions from Wireshark. It can be a bit overwhelming at first if you've never used it, but there's a lot of cheat sheets out there and some like intro to Wireshark guides that'll help you understand how to use it effectively in your analysis. It is free and open source at wireshark.org, and they have a 64-bit version of the Mac client that works great. It's available for Windows and Linux as well. Here's what it looks like. As you can see, this is a list of captured packets. Here's one example of an analysis graph that shows throughput over time. And here is a list of HTTP requests for that specific session. There's thousands and thousands of different ways to analyze traffic in Wireshark. I couldn't even go into it. If you wanted to try it on the Mac, the graphic interface kind of bogs down during heavy sessions that I found. So I use using the command line tools. They're baked inside the application folder. Dump cap shows the list of interfaces, and then you start the capture on the specific interface that you want. It lists out the names and the EN numbers for that interface. And then if you need to divide a capture session, you can use the edit cap command to split them up into smaller chunks. So I'm going to walk you through a video recording of what it looks like to run a Wireshark session. We're going to take a freshly installed Mac with Catalina. I plugged it into another Mac, running Wireshark, and turned on internet sharing on that Mac. So the second that Mac boots up, I've got Wireshark running, and I'm going to start capturing packets. So here you can see the main screen. We're going to select the USB Ethernet adapter on the host, and then we're going to go up to the top left corner and click the little shark fin. And at this point, I am now going to turn on the other Mac, and you can see all the packets that are coming through. You see DHCP requests. You see time of day requests, HTTP, HTTPS, TLS connections. It even shows you version 1.2, version 1.3, bonjour traffic, pretty much everything you want to know that's going on in this machine, it's going to capture it. Now, after you've captured that traffic, you're going to want to kind of get a breakdown of the data. So for this example, I'm looking only at DNS connections. So I applied this filter, DNS, and DNS flags response 0 means this message is a query, not a response, and DNS query type equals 1 means A records only. Excuse me, A records only. DNS has like MX and pointer and any and service records. We only want to know original requests for a specific domain name. And then we're going to export the specified packets to a CSV file and process in terminal for unique entries. So it looks like this. We're going to use the awk command to print the 7th column of the CSV file, use the stream editor to get rid of the quotes that are in the raw file, and then every line of this is going to start with standard query, yada, yada, yada. So we want to remove up to the 25th character. That leaves us with, sorry, this clicker is being real funky. There we go. That leaves us with just the host names. Over a long session, there's a lot of duplicates, so we want to get rid of the duplicates using that command. Don't ask me how. I actually looked it up on Stack Overflow. And then we're going to use grepv.net to get rid of the Akamai CNAME records, or all of the Akamai hosts that are the byproduct of the DNS query, because we want to see the original apple.com or the original requests only. So this is what you get at first 10 minutes of a computer with the enrollment, with DEP and supervision. This is what you get. It's not a complete list, but it's a pretty good representation of all of the hosts that a Mac will connect to. And it really helps understand that there is not just, apple.com or push.apple.com, but there's a whole other mess of services here that a Mac needs to connect to in the course of its enrollment and its lifetime. You'll notice in the third column, jamf.acme.com, you'll see that your MDM server is indeed contacted during this process. And as you do this, remember the Akamai. There is no basement in the Akamai, but it is a content distribution network that you need to keep in mind as you follow the DNS requests and set up your host whitelist. So your firewall needs to follow the original apple.com request to its conclusion. Those are 3 of the most common host name suffixes for a domain name, for Akamai, and that's all spelled out in their edge host names, API, if you're curious. This article, if there's one article you take away from this conference and you take back to your information and security teams, it's this one right here. HT210060, using Apple products on enterprise networks. This article is awesome, and I have to give special credit to the Mac Solutions architecture team for putting this together for us. This is hugely helpful because it lists all of the major hosts and ports and connection types that are required for Apple devices, including whether or not they support proxying. So thank you again, Mac Solutions architects. Now, if you still need help testing something on your network and you have an SE that you can reach out to, I highly recommend you ask them about the Mac eval utility. This is something new that the Solutions Architects team came up with. It was a co-development of the Apple Professional Services and Solutions Architecture team. At its essence, it does a network evaluation readiness check for you, and it shows you in a very simple report what's working, what isn't, what things you need to change. It looks for APNS reachability, whether you have Jamf or not, if your MDM is reachable, could you enroll this machine? It's a whole hundreds and hundreds of things that it looks for. It produces a concise report with action items, and if you want to try this out, please reach out to your Apple account team for details. If you're looking for a deeper dive into MDM, I recommend you take a look at this white paper from Jesse Undahl and Max Belanger from Fleetsmith. They did a deep dive into macOS MDM, and they presented it at the 2018 Black Hat Conference. It's a great read, extremely detailed if you want to see the communication from an MDM server to an Apple device and the entire cycle, including the DEP and the reseller process of getting devices in there. It's a really good article. And then, of course, Charles Edge and Rich Troutner are coming out with a new book about Apple device management. This will be available at fine booksellers in a few weeks, I think. And they have a chapter that goes deep into what MDM does and how it works. The last thing is, if you're network guys or if you yourself want to understand the fundamental rules and safety, how do I say this? The security context for certain kinds of network traffic and whether the level of risk involved in allowing this traffic on your network, Palo Alto has a free database called Applepedia that you can look up all different kinds of traffic, and they'll give you a risk profile for that traffic, for that type of connection. Now, what's possible when everything works? Let's take a look at that. A quick video run through of what the ultimate unboxing looks like. You're going to get automatic enrollment and supervision, quick deployment of apps, and a delightful user experience. So here we have a Mac that's enrolled in Apple Business Manager. The user is informed that the computer belongs to their employer, and they're challenged for the credentials that they were given at orientation. Then they're asked a few more questions. Note that most of the other options are going to be skipped here, and then when they're done, they're taken to the desktop. This constitutes a pretty basic enrollment in Jamf, so we need to maybe ask additional questions of that user to help categorize the computer properly. This is especially important if you do sites in Jamf. You don't necessarily know what site that machine might need to go in, so you ask the user maybe what office are they in. Then the information is logged locally, and you can pick that up with an extension attribute. So here the user's just filling out a few questions. It's really straightforward. And then we can even do things with like ServiceNow integrations. You know, if they need to order some stuff, they can tell you that during this walkthrough. And what's cool about this one is that you can even send them to a website to read about your company's history or some of the key products and services that you offer while their apps are installing. So instead of, you know, sitting there waiting 30 minutes, you can entertain them a little bit while their computer's all set up. So when that's all done, you have a fully enrolled and a good Mac. Quick shout out. This app, if you recognize it, it's not Splash Buddy. This is actually a new one that was released just a couple of weeks ago. It's called Ceremony. And it's built by the people over at Amari's Consulting. They are doing a demo of this in the GitHub gallery on Thursday, so I recommend you check it out. Now, what happens when our Apple devices cannot contact Apple? Well, we might run into some problems. There's a number of things that they need that will just not work, or you'll have difficulty managing in your environment. So automatic device enrollment, manual enrollment, security policies and config profiles, software updates, management actions, the entire user experience, and returning devices to service. So automatic device enrollment, if your Macs cannot reach the activation servers, they can actually skip past the remote management screen and be completely unenrolled and unmanaged. Apple has indicated that they don't see that changing anytime soon. A Mac is not an iPhone, and there's a whole fundamental different experience that goes along with it. So you want to make sure that your Macs can talk to Apple right out of the box. Even if you went to install the Macs and enroll them manually, when it goes to install that second MDM profile and try to establish the link or the trust with the MDM server, it will fail because APNS is not reachable in your environment. Security policies that you want to install, enforce, like restricting iCloud, restricting preference panes, file vault key escrow, special overrides that are only available via supervision, or kernel extension whitelisting, PPPC, these kinds of things can only be done with the config profile that's installed and triggered by APNS so that your computer reaches out to the MDM server and downloads it. Side-loading profiles using the profiles command is probably not going to work after Catalina. So if you're doing that now, you need to figure out a way to get away from that or be prepared for the consequences. Software updates. How many of you here have, in your environment, have had a problem where a user comes to you with a Mac Portable and it says, a critical update is required to be installed on your Mac? Yep. And what do they have to do? They got to go home, or they got to go to Starbucks or who knows what and get on the free Wi-Fi. This happens because the Mac cannot reach the Apple activation servers to validate the firmware for that update. And so then you have this problem where it will not continue to boot until that firmware is installed. You also don't get the deferral actions that you get with software updates. I think that was introduced with iOS 10, no. Yeah, 10.3 or somewhere thereabouts. It was introduced springtime last year. And then if you're having even more fundamental problems reaching Apple's software update servers, you may miss out on like the background and the critical updates for Gatekeeper, Xprotect, and the malware removal tool. So make sure your MacBook can connect, and then there's an article there about the background updates and what they're for. Management actions. You need to have a user-approved MDM profile and APNS to be able to enable and disable these things, to do remote lock wipe and override activation lock. User experience. How many of these have we seen? Do we like these? No, of course not. Our users hate them even more. So to manage this effectively, you need user-approved MDM, and you need to build a profile, and it needs to be delivered via APNS. So if you don't have that, you can't manage these things. Your users are going to have a bad time. And then you can't deliver self-service notifications, which we love people to let them know that there's software updates available. Then you have things like VPP in the App Store. In highly secure environments, this may not work. It should be proxyable in theory. But then they're not going to have FaceTime or iMessage working in their environment. We're actually having that problem right now. And then no continuity or handoff. Now, here's another question. Is imaging dead? Yes. I didn't hear you. Is imaging dead? Yes. Thank you. All right, and thank you, Mike Lynn, for setting up that webpage. So when it comes time to restoring a Mac and returning it to service and giving it to another user, the internet recovery loads in the firmware, and it requires either an open Wi-Fi connection or WPA2 with a basic pre-shared password. It does not work with 802.1x networks. You need to either have an Ethernet with a clear path to the internet. We don't have any of these things at our office either, and we're working on this. So we often have to tell our techs to do other things to get this working. So yeah, you need this for internet recovery and macOS recovery. Obviously, you need to have external DNS resolution, no proxies or SSL decryption. If you must, consider asking for a limited Wi-Fi network that is for deployments that only allows traffic to Apple and certain services as needed. There is another motion picture studio in Los Angeles that has a deploy network, and it's very obvious what it's for. So that can be a strategy for you. So those are all the things that don't work and how you're going to have a bad time if APNS isn't working. Now, a lot of us work in shops that are Windows heavy or maybe some kind of a balance, 50-50. Let's play devil's advocate for a second. What if Microsoft told you to prepare for a Windows notification service? Well, they did in 2011. The Windows notification service was actually introduced in Windows 8, if you can believe that, and they have articles that explain how to do it. So, if you think that your company would jump for doing something if Microsoft told you to, then, what about the Mac? And it should probably be said at this point that because of the changes Apple is making, you may become unsupportable by Jamf and Apple if you don't make these changes. They're just going to say, we're sorry, we really can't help you with this until this works. So, as I said, this one article, start here. This is a great place to open a dialogue with your information security teams. We want to be thinking globally about managing Macs, not locally. So set baseline security with MDM, and then reinforce the concepts of security with your users through ongoing education, teaching them about how to spot phishing attempts, teaching them what malware looks like, understanding safe computing practices, these kinds of things. We want to try to monitor for malicious traffic at the network perimeter and not do it on the device with local security agents wherever possible, because this can have an impact on battery life. It's really time to stop sticking our heads in the sand about this, but it's also the time for your security teams to stop doing this as well. But we can help them by bringing that information to them. And there's another thing that we can do is if you know someone in your organization who is a Mac advocate, but is not necessarily in IT, I would make friends with that person and then try to extend your network of contacts within the rest of the company to people who can champion your cause and work their way up the chain and try to get these approvals. Because ultimately, the CIO or someone at a very senior level is going to say, hey, my Mac can't do all these cool things that the company that I came from. Why? And then you can say, well, because we need APNS. And so then he'll say, make it happen, and then everybody down the chain has to do it. So make friends in high places and get people on your side. So why do we need to care about mobile device management? We want consistent, delightful experiences for our end users, and we want to streamline the support model for our IT staff. The less variables they have to worry about, the easier it is for them to support you and support your end users. And this can also empower your end users to take care of things themselves when they have awesome tools in the self-service portal that you can design for them. We want to remember the human as we craft our information and security policies. Trust people to do the right thing and assume positive intent, because people are awesome. And lastly, Apple means business, and I mean that in many contexts here. APNS is the gateway to mobile device management. Mobile device management will give you great experiences with Apple devices, and Apple makes the best tools for people. Here's my list of references. And I want to thank you for attending my presentation. So with that, we have a few minutes for questions. Maybe we can bring the house lights up a bit. So yeah, any questions from the audience?
Point of clarification. Hold on, we got a mic question.
Yeah, clarification?
Yes.
So you mentioned the article that folks from Apple wrote on the enterprise hosts. I just
Yes.
want to say that it was not just Mac Solutions Architects.
I did. It was Apple Professional Services and Mac Solutions
It was
Architects.
more than that.
Okay.
It was Apple Care. It was the consulting engineering team that's based here. It was software engineering. There was a huge pool of people involved in getting that done, not just the MSAs.
Awesome. And you guys really deserve a round of applause for that. Thank you. It's really good to have sort of an authoritative resource like that that you can bring to people in your organization and say, here, this is what Apple is saying about it. Now go to it. Any other questions, comments? Got a hand up somewhere? All right.
Appreciate it. So while we're in the business of taking credit for that article, it could only happen with enterprise environments where the actual Apple engineers could come and visit and validate these things in practice. And so having been sort of involved in some of that with that team and a colleague who basically was almost single-handedly responsible for pushing for that kind of stuff, I would highly recommend that with the Apple support article, where you have additional columns for proxy support and whether or not it requires 17.8 or just a name, that you continue to pressure Apple to basically add specificity to each of those columns and just extend it and extend it. And the more you do that, the less you'll have to fight with your own network security teams. So.
Sure, that's a great piece of feedback. Thank you. I mean, I can't do anything about it, but that's great feedback for the Apple teams. Any other questions, comments? Did I cover everything you thought I was going to? Everything good? Okay. Oh, one more.
Hey there.
Hi.
So what about folks that do not have the next-gen firewall capability for whitelisting FQDNs or host names? Sound like you alluded to that earlier.
Yeah, and I alluded to that in my 2017 presentation. I would say that you should probably ask them why they haven't upgraded yet. It seems like that might be a budgetary issue or maybe a reluctance to get that stuff. Is there a specific technical reason why that your organization hasn't upgraded to something like that? Or is it just a budget or political thing? Or
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
To kind of follow up on that, in my own organization, shall we say, not all the firewalls have upgraded to by hostname. And sometimes what you need to do is just kind of break it down into just how many IPs are going to have to whitelist. And then all of a sudden, they just allow all outbound. Like I did that with AWS. They were like, so what are we going to need to whitelist? And I gave them all the ranges. And they're like, we'll just authorize all outbound.
And that list of IP addresses for the APNS pool did change somewhat from 2 years ago. So yeah, there's proof there. Yes.
Not to sidetrack, what was that project's ceremony you said?
Yeah, Ceremony. It's brand new. They had a 1.0 release 2 weeks ago, and they have a Slack channel, Ceremony, and they're also presenting at the GitHub Gallery on Thursday.
How did they spell it?
Ceremony.
Okay. I did a quick Google search and I couldn't find it.
Yeah, getceremony.app. Was there a question over here? Yes? No, I heard some. Anything else?
So I work with a very restrictive network, and our Jamf server is having errors connecting to gateway.push.apple.com. But in testing, some of our devices are still receiving configuration profiles. Do you have any idea how that's working?
Yeah, so it could be an intermittent issue. So one thing I noticed about the MDM command queue monitor in Jamf Pro is that it fires off every 5 minutes, but then if there are push notifications queued, it sends them out in batches of 100 devices or 100 push notifications. It might be a thing where your firewall is analyzing the traffic, and if it sees what it might consider as an unusual pattern, that it blocks it. Palo Alto is a great example of that, where they're doing analysis of traffic on the fly. And if you had set a rule for APNS based on the original spec, it's only a 256 byte packet, whereas now it could be up to 4 kilobytes, depending on the implementation. So I would say work with the firewall team and have them do like a live monitor session. You know, they have the ability to do TCP dump on their equipment and then analyze it in Wireshark, and they can see exactly where it's breaking down and then just monitor the source IP from your Jamf Pro server. Is it in the DMZ or is it behind like a corporate network?
It's behind the network.
Okay. Also consider asking for a node in the DMZ and ask for a bridge between the two, between corporate and the DMZ. That's another way that you might be able to make that work better.
That's our next step if we can't get this working.
Sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Perfect. Thanks everybody so much. That is all the time we have.
Thank you.